and drag his mother away and just shove her in with hundreds of other Jewish women into a freight car, and only to have her life taken at the hands of these murderers. How he saw his own grandmother murdered in the stairway of her home. How he saw 89 of his immediate relatives tortured and ultimately killed in the hands of this murderous regime. But then he tells this rather electrifying story. He himself was taken into a concentration camp, and his duties involved taking care of the hospital premises. When a nurse came to him and said, "Excuse me, sir, are you a Jew?" And he said, "Yes." She said, "I have somebody who wants to see you." And she ushered him to a hospital room that had all the intimations of sickness and death. And there was a man lying there bandaged from head to toe, except for an opening for his nostrils, for his mouth, and for his ears, so he could breathe, so he could speak, and so he could listen. Bandaged up was the rest of his body and in pain. And he asked Mr. Wiesenthal to identify himself. He really was of Jewish stock. He said, "Yes, sir, I am." He said, "I want to say something to you. I have just a few minutes to live. I'm dying." He said, "I'm dying a very painful death physically, but even more is my death emotionally. The guilt within me is tearing me apart. I have been responsible for killing hundreds of your people." And then he narrated the most recent episode, which was very blood-curdling and chilling to the bones of Simon Wiesenthal. He said, "Before I die, sir, I want you to do me just one favor. I am truly sorry. I am torn apart by guilt. I beg you, would you please find it in your heart, in whatever way you can, to forgive me? I don't want to die with this guilt in my hands. I want somebody from that nation to say to me that he personally forgives me." Wiesenthal several times says he tried to turn to walk away, but the man just beckoned and pleaded and begged. He said, "I want to hear you telling me you forgive me. I beg you." Simon Wiesenthal says in his book that he thought about it for 30 to 45 seconds, could not bring it in his heart to pronounce the words, "I forgive you," thinking of all of the atrocities, turned away and left the man in his room silent as Wiesenthal pulled the door shut. After many years, he himself began to think about whether he had done right or whether he had done wrong, whether he even had the prerogative to pronounce the man forgiven. He wrote to 32 important personages around the world, some of them Nobel laureates, some of them experts in theological thinking, psychological thinking, dealing with all of the arena of guilt. And out of them, 26 of them wrote and told him that they thought he'd done the right thing. Only 6 thought it was very questionable whether he ought to have walked away without in some way trying to bring some forgiveness to this man. Fascinating story. I cannot pretend to stand here and tell you whether it was easy or difficult for this man to have pronounced forgiveness. I cannot even stand here and tell you whether he had the prerogative in his person to do something as massive as that on behalf of his nation. But I am only telling you that story to put it in historical context. We must understand that this is not some reluctant prophet who wants to be on the run. This is a prophet whose passions run deep on behalf of his people. This is a prophet without in some way trying to bring some forgiveness to this man. Fascinating story. I cannot pretend to stand here and tell you whether it was easy or difficult for this man to have pronounced forgiveness. I cannot even stand here and tell you whether he had the prerogative in his person to do something as massive as that on behalf of his nation. But I am only telling you that story to put it in historical context. We must understand that this is not some reluctant prophet who wants to be on the run. This is a prophet whose passions run deep on behalf of his people. This is a prophet where the memory is not faltering for him. This is a prophet who lived in the part of the world where history never dies. If you were to take a manual today and see what's happening in Bosnia, if you were to go to one group of people and ask them, in the name of reason, what are you doing killing tens and thousands of this group of people in your own nation? One of them will stand and look you in the eye and say, have you read your history from 40 years ago of what they did to hundreds of thousands of my people and what happened 6 centuries ago where both of us were victimized by a third? I am not in any way trying to absolve the situation. I'm only trying to tell you how deeply you can react in moments of history locked into such intense antipathy and hate. William Barclay, the scholar of the New Testament, says, when you go to the matrix of civilization of that time, which Jonah refers to, peoples there were the most hating and the most hated people in that particular context. That's what's happening here. He does not want to go to Nineveh because the Ninevites had been ruthless with his people. Thousands of his own people had been murdered by them. In fact, in extra-biblical literature, you will see pictures of skulls arranged in a pyramid. When the Ninevites came and stormed a nation, they would take the intelligentsia, decapitate them, and build some kind of a pyramid of skulls to say, we've been here too. That's the kind of trauma that is going on. But as Jonah is commanded to go, he is told to go 500 to 700 miles in the northeasterly direction. He doesn't want to do it. He goes down to Joppa, buys himself a ticket, and he's moving 2,000 miles in the westerly direction as he catches himself a boat and moves on to Tarshish. Interestingly enough, 800 years later, in the same setting in Joppa, Peter is having to deal with a similar command to take the gospel to Cornelius. Remember that story? And Peter says, this is an unclean mission you're sending me on. And God says, don't call that unclean, which I have called clean. A few chapters later in the New Testament, you notice Paul talking to the people who wanted to lynch him. And Paul goes to a Roman centurion and says, would you please guard me as I tell these people why my mission is taking me where it is? And the people listen back, they sit down, they're listening to his talk on his conversion and all of the drama of it. They are in pin drop silence. And then the Bible says, until he said that one word when they wanted to take his life for it. What is that one word? That word is when Paul says, God has commissioned me as a missionary to the Gentiles. As soon as the word Gentile was used, it sort of lit a fuse, and they were ready to say, away with him. They wanted his life. That's what's happening here. Jonah is this reluctant man in the boat, and as he is moving in that opposite direction, he goes down into the lower part of the boat, and he puts his head down on a pillow, and he's sound asleep. Instead of going 500 miles in the northeasterly direction, he's heading 2,000 miles in the westerly direction. Can I say something to you? When you know something to be right, and you're not living by that, you will never stand still. You have to move in the opposite direction. And as Jonah was sound asleep, trying to run from this reality, the captain of the boat comes and wakes him up, and you know the story. Jonah says, look, fellas, it's me. If it weren't for me, this would not have happened. So he says to them, why don't you take me and throw me overboard? The storm will be stilled. You know, I've often wondered about that suggestion from Jonah. If he really were as genuine as he was trying to be or appeared to be, why did he want them to throw him overboard? Why didn't he say, I'll do you a favor and I'll jump overboard myself? But he cannot live up to the responsibility to what he knows to be true. Bertrand Russell, the great English philosopher, was once asked, when you stand before God and find out that he really exists, what are you going to say to him as a disclaimer of why you rejected him there? And he says, well, I will just look God in the eye and say to him, you did not give me enough evidence. Very interesting. When the book of Romans tells us man's problem is not the absence of evidence, it is the suppression of it. And here is Jonah suppressing that evidence, moving 2,000 miles in the westerly direction. And what is really happening is that intriguing contest between God and Jonah trying to get his attention. And I see three problems in the mind of Jonah.